Hey, y'all.
I'm gonna do it now. Hold your horses. All right, that's better. Hello. Welcome back to Night Shift with Andrea Update. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hello, Ryan Sanders. How are you?
Wonderful.
Well, good. Y'all, we're a little bit late getting started, but that only matters to the 1.5 of you in the chats right now. If you are new to Night Shift, this is a live YouTube show every Tuesday night. I guess just depending on when I can get into the studio and get going, evidently seems to be the case. And tonight was no exception. Otherwise, we drop to wherever you listen to your podcast. So iTunes, Spotify, whatever you listen to your stuff. Where do you listen to your stuff?
Spotify.
Okay.
I fixed my problem, by the way.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Tonight comes with, I consider, a pretty extreme warning. I don't often give those out. This is a true crime show, so if you're here, you know what you're here for. We have enough of those that circulate all over the world now that we all kind of know what that looks like. In saying that, this one is going to deal heavily with child. I'm going to use the codes a little bit right now, just so since we are on a live show. If we were pre-recorded, I could kind of say whatever I wanted and I wouldn't have to code talk. But we've learned, get booted off of live if that's what happens. So this involves child SA, if you will, and just all kinds of things like that. So very much like it's this isn't a gory one. We have sometimes crazy murders, or we talk about crime scenes, and this one is not going to be one so much like that. But it's just very, very heavy topics. It is a case Brian and I have talked about. I put it on my story. If you saw that on Instagram on Andrea Update earlier, that and this is real business. I have heard of this case for the past few years on and off. It's actually a pretty old case. But it's the kind of case it's just been weighing really heavy, even just like researching it. And the more we've talked about it, it's tough. It's really, really tough. So in saying that, I was going to originally never plan to actually do a show on this case. But here we are. So I've decided to go on and do this, and we are going to talk about kind of why we're talking about this case at the end. If you are new here, you can log into YouTube and join the chats. It's free. It doesn't cost a thing. Just have a YouTube account, and we will engage with the chats after the show is all wrapped up. Also, for those of you who may be new here, Brian Sanders is a retired homicide lieutenant. So obviously in a true crime show, his expertise can lend a lot of knowledge and help with when we discuss these kinds of things. So are you ready to get into it?
I am. I want to say hello to Michael Broderick.
Well, hello, Michael Broderick.
He's in our chats watching the show tonight.
All right.
He's a former Marine, current actor, been in True Detective, NCIS, Terminal List.
Does it dox him if we say, it does dox him. Does he care if we say where he lives?
I'll leave that up to him. He can say it in the chat. But yes, he was also in a rock band.
Okay.
In New York City, and met his wife at CBGB's.
Well, how cool is that?
And he has great stories. So we're glad he's here tonight.
Well, he said it. So okay. I was going to say, so he's saying Nashville. Are you, Michael, are you in Nashville proper? Did we discuss this? I feel like Brian and I discussed this. And you don't have to say exactly, but if you don't want to, but are you in a suburb of Nashville, potentially? Well, I'll read it in a second. No pressure to, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes to one of those questions. So he's either in Nashville or in a suburb of Nashville. Yeah. Either way, that's my old stomping grounds. That's where I was born and raised. My family's still back there. So, okay, yeah. So he's in the fancy new part of Nashville. All right, well, welcome, Michael. It's great to have you. We appreciate your support here. So without further ado, we generally start with pop culture that occurred in the year in which the case we are covering took place, just to kind of take us back there and kind of set the scene. We both agreed tonight we didn't want to do that. This case, I can't really go from Cyndi Lauper to then this case. So we're going to scratch that for tonight, and we're going to get started with it. All right. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Stayner brothers. You're going to notice that I labeled the show, at least for now, unless I change it, a modern day Cain and Abel. And you're going to see why And we're going to see the depths to which a family can encompass all kinds of things. So we're going to get started now talking about Stephen Stayner. If you are in the chats, I am flipping over. Brian will still be able to talk to you, but I'm going to switch over because I have quite a few photos to show you. So if I miss a question or a remark here and there, that may happen because I'll be going back to the other page to show pictures here and there. But I do want you to get a look at little Stephen Stayner. I know I have one of him just alone as a child. Yeah, here he is. All right. So this is Stephen Stayner around 1972. Okay. Stephen was born, he was the third of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner. So you'll hear us refer to his dad as Del. That's what he went by. In Merced, California. Stephen had 3 sisters and an older brother named Carrie. His brother was actually 4 years older than him. So he was born in 1965, I believe. So his family, again, it's a family with 5 children. So it's a family of 7. They've got a family dog. They're, again, in Merced, California, a really nice little area. They were a pretty typical family in the 60s and 70s. They were actually part of a Mormon church. That's actually going to play into this case a little bit. And so Stephen was just known to be an outgoing little boy. They said he was kind of mischievous. He was real spunky, a lot of fun. And he was in elementary school. And like I said, he and his brother Carrie were pretty close, and they would oftentimes walk to and from school together. So on the afternoon of December 4th, 1972, Stephen was walking home from school by himself. Now, this was a day that was like kind of spitting snow. It was very windy. It was actually a pretty cold day there. Stephen's mom, you'll find out later, actually left home to drive to the school to try to catch Stephen before he left because she didn't want him to have to walk home in this yucky cold weather. But when she got there, he had already left. And then she gets home to find her husband, Dell, Stephen's dad, in the garage working on a car. And she asks him, if he's seen Stephen, and Stephen had not come home yet. They assume at this point, nothing big. He's probably just at a friend's house, when in fact, the truth could not be further from that. So as he's walking, he was approached by a man named Irvin Edward Murphy. We're just going to call him Irvin. Okay. So Irvin was talking to little Stephen and kind of building rapport with him, if you will. He wasn't causing any alarm to Stephen. He's just a little boy. And then Irvin asks him if he would like, he has these pamphlets. Okay. So he's like brandishing these like church-based pamphlets. And he's asking Stephen if, hey, would you like to donate? Do you have any extra change on you? We're collecting money for our church. I say a lot of things on this show in absolutes, and one of them is I feel like a crime can't get much worse than when you involve using the church as a guise to start your whatever it is that you're doing. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's a whole special kind of punishment that entails there. But so he says that he's gathering money for the church and asks if little Stephen would contribute. And so at first it's like no, he kind of brushes him off. But Stephen was raised to be polite to strangers. We're going to talk about that later. And he says finally, well, I think my mom probably would. My mom would probably donate some money. Okay. So about that time, when he says that would probably happen, then this guy named, we're going to call him, he goes by, his last name is Parnell. He pulls up and drives up to where Irvin is standing with Stephen. Okay. And so I want to make sure I'm not missing something here. So he pulls up in this white Buick. Okay. So Stephen gets into the Buick because now he's with this guy he's been talking to, right? So we've talked about grooming or the idea of a way to kidnap a child, and he's doing it because he's not, now a stranger man who's driving this car isn't yanking this kid into the car. Now we don't have any kicking or screaming. He goes in the car willingly, albeit a little hesitantly, but not with a fight, not with commotion. So he's not drawing any attention to them. So he gets in this, he gets in this white Buick with Kenneth Parnell and now this other guy, Irvin Murphy. So they were working as a team, unbeknownst to Stephen at this time. So there was instructions. Irvin knew that he was going to walk through little areas of town and he's going to pass out these little religious pamphlets. Okay. And when he does that to all these little boys walking home from school, it's kind of, you just keep doing it till you get one that sticks. Okay. So that's exactly what he did. Again, they're working in conjunction with one another, and Kenneth pulls up. Now, Kenneth and Irvin know each other because they were co-workers at a resort in Yosemite National Park. So we're going to come back to Yosemite a couple of times. If you're from the West Coast, the area they lived in, you will be familiar with. It was close to the park, which obviously is huge. But because of that, there were quite a few just kind of odds and ends type job opportunities. So handymen, window cleaners, you name it. So these two work together. Okay. It will be known later that Irvin is a few years Kenneth Parnell's junior, and he now would probably very likely be diagnosed somehow with quite a diminished IQ. So whatever if it was a learning disability, if it was something that happened, at birth or in the womb, but either way, his IQ would not have been very high and almost special needs himself, but he fully believed everything that Richard Parnell told him. Okay. So there becomes a question toward the end of this as to how much, I don't know, how much guilt, how much blame you want to put on Irvin by the time this is all said and done. And Irvin will say that Parnell, that, I keep wanting to call him, it is Kenneth Parnell, that he, said that, hey, look, I grew up in a broken home. I was abused. I hate that any child has to go through that. So why don't you help me? I want to find a little boy to take home with me that I can raise. It will heal me, and I will help raise a child properly the way they need to be raised. Okay. So Irvin believes him with this, and he goes along with it. So that's why he didn't feel like he was complicit in a kidnapping necessarily, right? He didn't feel like he was doing something bad by taking this little boy off the side of the road. So that's what they do. So they start driving, and as they drive, little Stephen is telling them where he lives. He's 7. He knows where he lives. He knows how to get to his street. And he starts to get concerned as they pass the street that he lives on. Okay. And so he starts asking questions. Stephen was interviewed multiple times after all of this took place. And so a lot of what we're talking about isn't at the testimony of Kenneth Parnell. This came from Stephen's mouth. Okay. So he says he started to get a little nervous. He wasn't too frightened yet, but he didn't understand why they were passing his house. And soon enough, they realized after driving for about 30 minutes that he was not in fact going home at all. He was going to go to this shack that Kenneth lived at, that Irvin did not live in, but visited quite often. And that is where Stephen is going to be for the next 7 years. Okay. So they get there. I'm going to tell you a little bit now, and this is where all of the yucky that I told you, if you're just joining us, this is a really heavy case. This is kind of where some of this starts. So I'm going to read you a little bit about Kenneth Parnell. Let me see if I have a picture of him solo to show you, so you kind of can see who we're talking about. Well, there he is as an old man. Either way, I'll show you. This is not a great shot of him. This is him many years later. This would have been actually probably about 25, 30 years later. But Kenneth Eugene Parnell was born in 1931 in Amarillo, Texas. All right. So in March, we know a little bit about his history later on. These things were not known about Kenneth at this time. But we find out later that in March of 1951, so about 20 years prior to this, Kenneth was arrested for assaulting. Again, I'm using some code words here because we're on a live YouTube show and we'll get kicked off. For assaulting a young boy and impersonating a police officer. So evidently he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and he had lured the child through the use of a deputy sheriff's badge that he bought at an Army-Navy surplus store. He escaped then from the state institution that he was in Norwalk, but was recaptured. So in it's tough. So he had an interview in the year 2000, reflecting on that 1951 assault on that little boy. And when asked why he did it, this is all the way, guys, 50 years later. When asked why he did it, he said that he kidnapped and molested the little boy because his wife was pregnant at the time and he had to find another outlet. I'm reading you these gory thoughts and details from this man because we're going to talk about recidivism rates and thoughts on whether or not rehabilitation is even an option in sex offenders, much less to children, right? And pedophiles. So that happened in 51. Then he was convicted of armed robbery in Utah. And then we are pretty sure the list goes on and on with multiple boys as time goes on with this guy. Okay. So this is the history that he's got, and that's the mindset that he has. So know that that's the mindset he had in going into his little mission of finding a boy to bring home with him. Right. All right. So on the first night that Stephen is at Kenneth's house, he was molested. So that starts right off the rip, right when he gets there. And he begins fully engaging in the SA, the abuse, pretty immediately. So during this first week, of course, Stephen is saying he wants to go home. And Kenneth is telling him that he can't go home. And he's telling him that he talked to his parents and they said, you can stay another night. And when Stephen asks, this is some of the stuff that just makes you want to, thinking about it from a parent's perspective, Kenneth would even get on the phone and pretend to be talking to Stephen's mother, Kay, and, have this one-sided conversation where he's saying, okay, yeah, he can stay another night, almost as though it was at her request. Mm-hmm. And then he starts convincing Stephen early on. Remember, we've talked about Stockholm and these kinds of things. He starts convincing Stephen early on that essentially his family was tight on money. And then he uses some stories that Stephen has given him. Like Stephen had been a little mischievous. He had gotten in a little trouble at home. And so Kenneth starts using those stories to say, like your parents could use a break. You've been getting in trouble at home. Money's tight anyway. They're fine with you staying another night. So finally, very soon into it, just within even the first week of living there, Stephen will say he started calling Kenneth dad about a week into being there, because you'll find out that Kenneth actually came home one day from work and told Stephen that he had just gone to court that day and had gotten custody of him, that he was now his dad. He told him that his name was going to, from now on, be Dennis, not Stephen. It was going to be Dennis Gregory Parnell. This is interesting because Gregory is actually Stephen's middle name, by the way. And that's it. Like, this is the beginning of that 7 years. It's going to come with the abuse, sexually, psychologically, and physically as well, separately than that. But so eventually he tells Stephen that his father has passed away, and he tells him that his family has moved off. So Stephen is only 7 years old, guys. So he is, of course, he believes this. He did say later in an interview that he was confused. Like when they asked him, like, well, what did you think about that, about your mom saying that you could stay there for an extra night, And he said, well, I was a little confused by it. It didn't seem like something she'd let me do. But he has no reason to not believe this adult in front of him either, right? So again, Kenneth starts calling him Dennis Gregory Parnell. He actually enrolls him in school. And so in the next few years, they move around a lot because he doesn't want to get caught. He did dye Stephen's hair a little bit darker. And they move around, and he goes to various schools as time goes on. Kenneth is considering himself and passing himself off to strangers as Dennis's dad this whole time. So they're moving throughout different areas in California. They live in Santa Rosa one of the times. And so Kenneth starts letting Stephen smoke marijuana and drink alcohol pretty early on. He'll say later it had to do with the abuse. He was kind of letting him partake in these things to kind of go along with what he was doing to him. And he said that Stephen had the option to come and go kind of as he pleased. And you've got to think, as time goes on, Kenneth still has to hold down a job. So Kenneth is going back and forth to work. Stephen is not chained up. He's not handcuffed or tied to the bed. He is now in what is basically considered his home. This is now his dad. This is where he lives. And he doesn't, most of the time, consider fleeing. We've talked about Stockholm Syndrome a lot. There are different circumstances in which it would take place. We even did a case on the Nuremberg, the bank robbery, which was in Stockholm, which is how the phrase, came about, because these people become a bit, emboldened to their captors, and they start to take on this role, like this give and take role. So in this situation, Stephen has taken on the role as the child to his captor, and the lines start getting blurred on truth and fantasy. So later, Stephen will say that he had considered fleeing a few times over the years, but that he just had no idea how. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who he could talk to, where to go. And he was also very terrified. So he had been threatened very severely with physical punishment if he were to ever try to either tell anyone what was going on in that home, or if he were to ever try to physically leave. Okay. So evidently Kenneth gives Stephen a dog. It's a terrier that is named Queenie. Kenneth's mother gave it to him, not knowing that he has a child in his home at this time. So Queenie actually becomes kind of main character in this story. As you can imagine, Stephen just clings to this dog. She is his best friend. And she is actually with him throughout this entire ordeal. So he loves Queenie very much. So he's got this little dog. It's just so bizarre to think about. But like I said, he's in these various schools. He's making friends. This is between the ages of 7 and 14 that he is with Kenneth Parnell. So these are very formative ages. He's going from elementary school into middle school, almost into high school. That's his de facto father at this point. And so because he's making friends, because he's having fun, some former classmates had been interviewed over the years, and they've said that, like I said, spunky was one of the words to describe him. He just wanted to hang out and do friend things. There is an account where some friends say that one day they were all outside and Stephen was walking, and that he started crying. He just out of the blue started sobbing and just said, "I want to go home." And they were confused because they only know Kenneth to be his dad and that to be his home. But later, Stephen says he remembered it when it was brought up to him, but he doesn't remember ever saying anything like that. So it sounds like almost like a little break, or maybe like a little blackout, maybe like a little dissociation or something. So he winds up letting friends come over. So Kenneth, I mean, talk about brazen. Yeah, he's bold. And so he lets Stephen have friends over. Now you find out later that here and there, some of the boys would say to Stephen that, hey, like, your dad made a pass at me, or your dad kind of did this weird thing, or whatever, or I didn't want to be by myself with your dad in this room. We find out even later, though, that very likely within a few of those friends that some things did actually happen. So there's a friend named Lloyd, a friend of Stephen's named Lloyd. And Lloyd has a mom named Barbara Matthias. Okay. So, excuse me. So Barbara, for a while, had been kind of a babysitter to Stephen. So can you imagine, though, again, about the boldness? Like, he's letting Stephen be alone with another adult where he could tell anything, but he doesn't. And then as they move around, they eventually come back to where this friend Lloyd lived and Barbara lived. And Barbara was going through a divorce with like an abusive husband, and starts seeing Kenneth. They start dating each other. They dated each other for about 18 months. Okay. She actually lives with them during this time period. But then you find out that she also was molesting Stephen. And Kenneth had, at least on a few occasions, made Stephen have sex with Barbara. At this time, Stephen was 9 years old. Okay. Her biggest defense later is that she, quote, had no idea he was kidnapped.
But she was,
Yeah.
she's good with doing that. Just didn't know he was kidnapped.
Yeah. She just thought he was his biological son. I'm going to go on and skip ahead and just go on and tell you this little tidbit later. Barbara was never charged with anything. She was not only was she not convicted, she was not charged with anything. Okay. As far as I know, she's still alive today. All right. So moving forward, Stephen's getting a little bit older and he is starting to enter puberty. So as terrible and disgusting and horrific as this is, we have different types of pedophiles and they have different proclivities. And with someone like Kenneth, once a child starts to reach puberty, they're aging out. Like this is not the turn on. This is not their fantasy. This is not what they want. Okay. So it's good for Stephen because now he's 14 years old and he's being told, but also what a mind twist too, right?
Yeah.
Because the sexual abuse is nothing that Stephen wants. Also, it's been that's been part of what has happened the whole time he's been there. Mm-hmm. He's considering him his dad, even though he somewhere knows he's not his dad. And now this is stopping. He's kind of throwing him away in that sense. I know that sounds horrible, but like in that sense, he's, tossing him to the side and telling him that he's not, no longer interested in that. So it's just so messed up. So, and guys, don't forget, Stephen has now lived with Kenneth as his father for the same amount of time that he lived at home with his biological family. So he's only 14 and he's been in both places for 7 years. Okay. So Kenneth tells Stephen that he wants to find a younger child to come home with them. So he tries to enlist the help of Stephen to ensnare this little one, to find this new little boy and to groom him the same way he had Irvin, right, convince Stephen to get in the car with him 7 years ago. Stephen immediately knows he does not want to do this. He is not interested in helping another young child come to this house. So he actually kind of foils these plans. So there are 2 or 3 times where Stephen is supposed to, act a certain part in this and acquire this young child for Kenneth. And he messes it up intentionally every time. Okay. So once Kenneth realizes that it's not going to happen, that Stephen's not going to be able to do this or won't do it successfully, he has to figure out some other way to do this, some other accomplice. So on February 14th of 1980, Kenneth and there was a teenage friend of Stephen's. So he takes one of Stephen's friends, that's a teenage boy named Randall Poorman, Sean Poorman. He's Randall Sean Poorman, but I think he went by Sean. And he bribes him with alcohol and pot, and I think like $50, mm-hmm. and says like, "Hey, can you help me get a kid?" Mm-hmm. Now, granted, we don't know. It doesn't matter. It's kidnapping nonetheless. But we don't know Sean's his knowledge of what all this meant, right? Mm-hmm. So he wanted the booze, he wanted the pot, he wanted the money, and so he helps Kenneth get a child. He actually helps kidnap 5-year-old Timothy White, and this is in Ukiah. So they actually Sean sees Timmy playing outside at his home, and he was kind of down a sidewalk a little bit, and he kind of didn't do it with as much finesse as Kenneth and Irvin did 7 years prior. But he kind of pushes Timmy up against this chain link fence and grabs at him, and they get him in the car. Now, Timmy did not go as quietly because his was obviously more of a forcible kidnapping. So he was kicking, he was screaming, and he was put in the car. So immediately when Stephen gets home from school that day, he is horrified to see 5-year-old Timmy there. Immediately upon kidnapping Timmy, who had bright blonde hair, that Sean boy who was the one to get him dyed his hair at Kenneth's request, dyed his hair a darker brown. I'm trying to see if I have a picture up. Here's Timmy. This is after Timmy's hair had been dyed. So that's 5-year-old Timmy White. Okay. He's just like a freckled face, little blonde boy. And again, in this picture, he has dark hair because they dyed it that way. All right. Whew. All right. So immediately, Stephen, it's almost like it all comes flooding back to him. And so where, as you can imagine, he had to separate himself from, his home, his real family with what he had now, because he doesn't really have a choice. This is what he's living. This is his life. So, but when he sees Timmy, he's immediately catapulted back into when he was taken and when he was told that his family didn't want him. So now he's starting to realize maybe that didn't really happen. Maybe my family did want me. Maybe my mom didn't say for me to spend the night here. But it's taken this kind of time, right, to understand that. But it all starts like a whirlwind the second Timmy is in the home. So Stephen said that he knew it was his like do or die moment. He said, that's it. I'm leaving. I'm taking Timmy with me. I've got to get this child out of here. He did not want Timmy to have any of the life he had for the last 7 years. So on March 1st of 1980, so it had been 16 days since Timmy had been taken. Okay. Kenneth had gone to his job. He had recently gotten a night job, and it was like a security job about 70 miles away, I believe. So it was a good chunk of miles away. But when he left, he actually said to Stephen, I'm going to work. I'll come back by if I forget anything. So Stephen's kind of terrified. So the first couple nights that he wants to do this, he doesn't. And then the night he decides to execute his plan, he waits until a considerable amount of time has gone by. And he scoops up Timmy, and it's in the middle of the night, and they leave. And they set off on foot. And they walk, I feel like it was many, many miles. And they walk for hours. And they walk to kind of the town that Timmy is from. Little Timmy's only 5 years old. So he can kind of describe where he lives or kind of convey the town that he lives, but he can't give Stephen his address. So Stephen can't get him actually to his home. But finally, they were able to get to a police station. So can you imagine being in this teeny tiny town, maybe one, maybe two deputies in this station. And Stephen tries to convince Timmy to go on inside alone. He says, go on in and talk to an officer. It's gone back and forth. Stephen says that he was always going to be going back to his biological family at this time, but it does kind of happen in a funny way, that he wants Timmy to be by himself. And there are some people who have thought that maybe Stephen would have gone back to Kenneth's, only again under this idea of, the Stockholm, not really knowing anything, any other thing to do. But either way, Timmy starts to go, but he starts sobbing. He doesn't want to be, at this point, he has bonded. He is bonded fully with Stephen, as you can imagine. And he does not want to leave Stephen's side. So even to go into the police department. So Stephen walks inside with him. And by daybreak on March 2nd, the next day, Kenneth Parnell was arrested on suspicion of abducting both of the boys. And when they go look into his background, right? That's when they find that previous conviction of sexual assault from 1951. Both children were reunited with their families that day. In fact, the story goes that when at Timmy's house, again, he had been gone for 16 days. When the phone rang, they called his mom and dad's home, and the phone rang and no one answered. And immediately they called their local police station back. This is before caller ID, y'all. This is before, remember again, landlines, no caller ID, but they didn't want to miss any calls. So they called the police station and said, did you by chance call me? And they said, we did. We have your son. And they are riddled with questions. Of course, they immediately he has a little sister. They wrap her in a blanket. They get in the car. They get to the station. And Timmy's mom will say that when she first saw him from across the room, from the back, she fell to the floor sobbing and sick because she didn't think it was him because she just saw the dark hair.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turned around and came to her. Oh, it just makes me. And it was Timmy, in fact. And she says that she held him for 20 minutes and neither one of them said a word. But the picture I showed you a moment ago, this is Timmy after he's been reunited with his mother. So that's why his hair is dark in this photo. Okay. So, you know, I told you they both were reunited with their families. Oh, my goodness. So there is Stephen, reunited with his mom and dad. This is very difficult to look at, and I'm going to tell you why. I tried to upload the video to YouTube. I can try to edit and put it in after the show once we're not live. I tried to do it prior. I had too big of a file, and it was causing me issues, whatever, so I didn't. But when you were to watch this, you know, now we do things very, very differently. We've learned so much more about trauma, about childhood trauma, about how to handle situations. Guys, Stephen was reunited with his family after 7 years in front of every news crew that could get there in time. In front of a full audience, camera bulbs in his face, or light bulbs in his face, camera, you know, microphones. And so when you see this photo of them hugging and see how bright it is, these are reporters. This is the moment his parents have first laid eyes on him, the moment he's first seen them. And it makes me want to be sick. I mean, I know I hate to say didn't know better then, but things were done very, very differently then. Here it is again. See all these people? That's his dad right behind him. That actually in the middle, I don't know if, can you guys see a mouse? I doubt it, right? No, okay.
No.
In the middle, if you look between, that's Stephen, of course, to the right. That's his dad holding his hand to the left. Between both of their heads in the back and kind of a trucker cap is actually Carrie, Stephen's older brother of 4 years. So now Carrie is 18. Okay. So, it's tough. It's really, really tough the way that worked, the way that reunion all happened. You guys, this story is, when I say just getting started, it gets crazy. We're about to have all the twists and turns. So that happens. They get back with their family. There is an interview. You can watch it on YouTube. I watched some of it. I was telling Brian about it, and it almost made me sick to my stomach. There's a video that I watched where he sits down. It's like a daytime talk show, and he's sitting there. His mom and his dad are on each side of him. Their lawyer is there with them because this was early on and it was an ongoing investigation. As the interviewer is queuing up to talk loudly with his microphone, and so Stephen, right? It shows the date at the top of the ticker tape or whatever of the frame. It was 2 weeks after he'd come home. It had been 2 weeks after being gone for 7 years with all of the horrific things that happened to him over those 7 years. And 2 weeks later, he's sitting in front of in a newsroom, essentially on a daytime talk show. And the guy is doing the things with the camera, you know. So Stephen, tell me what it was like the day you got in the truck of, Kenneth Parnell. Were you scared? Did you think about your family while you were gone? This kid is like, when you watch him, he's, it's like the lights are on, but nobody's home. He's just, you can see him. It's painful. It's very difficult.
Well, because he's remembering all of that.
He's now having to remember it because he had to separate himself from all of that. You know, for those 7 years, it's not that he wasn't thinking about his family, obviously, right? But he has to be in the moment he's in because that's the moment he's in. He can't, I think that's our body's way of, it is our body's way of coping. You can't constantly wish and hope that he was back home. He wouldn't survive that way. I will play you at least the audio for now, and then I'll try to put the video up later because I do want you to hear it of that interview when he's talking. Tell me if you have any trouble hearing this.
A man along the street just a few blocks from my house, and he asked me if I wanted to, me or my mother wanted to donate something to a church, and I had told him that my mother would probably want to, and so he offered me a ride home. I had refused the first time, telling him that my house is just a few blocks away, and he had asked me several more times, and after a while I had taken a ride. And then the car pulled up, and
Okay. If you're watching, I've got a newspaper clipping on the screen of Kenneth Parnell at his trial. That's about what he looked like. That's kind of a better indication of what he looked like at that time. So that what you just listened to was Stephen kind of detailing a little bit of the events that happened the day he got in the truck with Kenneth, but that's on that talk show that I was telling you about. It's disgusting. So Kenneth was not charged. If you were already upset, just get ready. Kenneth was not charged with the sexual assaults on Stephen or any of the other boys, because most of them occurred either outside of the jurisdiction of the Merced County prosecutor or were outside of the statute of limitations. In California at that time, the statute of limitations on sexual assault and on kidnapping was 3 years. 3 years.
That's crazy.
But so what they will say is, what prosecutors would say is that they couldn't, now that it's 1980 pushing 81, with that 3-year statutory statute of limitations, I'm getting ahead of myself, they couldn't charge anything that happened before 1977. And I find that obviously crazy, the 3 years, but that's within the span of the crime, the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's not been 3 years since he came home and then was trying to go back. Like, they're saying that even though you came into we got you days ago.
Yeah.
And that whole thing was one event. Like, that's a one-time bracket.
That's a huge problem. And I would hope that maybe that state has changed.
We'll talk about it. They have, but it took, let me tell you when it took until. So some stories will say like, oh, Stephen Stayner's story is what started having California look at laws and changing some things up with that. But it changed incrementally. I think it went from 3 years to 5 years. It was like that for a long time. Then it got a little bit longer. And if I'm not mistaken, I have it right here because I looked it up because I covered a case a few months ago where this actually California and the statute of limitations on sex crimes against minors was a topic of the conversation. And California eliminated the statute of limitations on child sexual assault as of 2024.
So they eliminate. So it's
now there's no statute of limitations.
Good. That's the way it should be.
As of this year.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Now.
It took that long.
Yeah. So get this. So not only did they not charge Kenneth. I didn't give you any of the detail either. You can use your imagination. It's freaking horrific. You don't need me to detail it, right? The things that he did to this child, multiple children. So he was not charged with any sexual assault. But get this, he was also couldn't be charged on first-degree kidnapping. He was only charged on second-degree kidnapping. And this is because in California at that time, to be charged with first-degree kidnapping, it has to include either a ransom demand or bodily injury. And sexual assault, even that of a minor, was not considered bodily injury. Therefore, they couldn't charge with first-degree kidnapping. So this month. So, okay, let me read you. I've got 7,000 papers up here. I haven't had anything to sip on. My throat's getting dry. Okay, so Kenneth was tried for second-degree kidnapping with Stephen Stayner and Timmy White. So get this, y'all. You ready? So between the two of them and everything that happened, he was charged and sentenced to 7 years total. And by now, we know about the 1951 rape of the little boy. We know by now Stephen's friends are starting to come forward. And then we know what happened to Stephen, and we know what happened. Now, Timmy, I will say, just so that there's no misinformation here, Timmy was actually not sexually assaulted. He had, now, Stephen didn't, but we know what happened to Stephen. But Timmy did immediately go have an examination when he was rescued, and there were no signs of sexual assault, nor has he ever said that happened. But even without him saying so, medical exam showed that had not happened yet. He was there for 16 days. It was, trust me, that was coming up. But in saying that, with everything that happened, Kenneth was given 7 years, served 5 of it. He served less time in prison for all of these things than Stephen was at his house. When I talk about a murderous rage, this case has, I go back and forth from being so riddled with sadness and just brokenhearted to just rage, full rage. So Irvin Murphy, remember, he was the kind of like low IQ co-worker of Kenneth that actually lured Stephen into the car, and he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and paroled after 2 years. You know, and I feel like 2 years for him is strong compared to the measly 5 that Kenneth got for his part in this. Now, Stephen has maintained that Irvin never touched him inappropriately, was never bad to him. Irvin was the one that lured him into the car, and he would often, as a coworker and a friend of Kenneth's, would often come to Kenneth's. Stephen seems to be under the impression that Irvin did not know what was going on, and that actually corroborates what Irvin always said. I just thought he was living with him. Like, I thought he was raising him. Irvin wasn't. We weren't working with everything there, right? So in that sense, and so Stephen actually never had anything bad to say. He said Irvin would bring him comic books, would eat snacks with him. It sounds like they almost had more of like a childlike friendship, the two of them. But so Irvin was served 2 years, and then that Sean Poole, the one who lured Timmy in to the tune of $50 and some pot, he spent some time in a juvenile work camp. But old Barbara, who we know did these things to Stephen multiple times, nothing, never charged with any violation. I have no words for her. Now, when Stephen references Barbara, he will say he did not like her. I mean, as you can imagine. But he liked it better when she was around, because that kind of took some of the heat off of him. Okay. So even though bad things still happened to him, it was much, much less frequency than when she wasn't there. Lord. Okay. So there's that. So now he comes home. So let's talk about this. Therapy? Absolutely not. You can forget that. So Stephen's dad did not want him going to therapy. First and foremost, I will let you know that the prosecutors also said another reason they didn't want to charge Kenneth with the sexual allegations is because they didn't want it to like look bad on Timmy, to make it worse for Timmy. They've got this all backward. This whole case will make you want to punch a wall. So Stephen comes back home. The dad says he doesn't need therapy. The mom will later say, we just kind of didn't talk about it. We just kind of didn't talk about it. He was not even only encouraged, not encouraged to talk about it. He was encouraged not to talk about it. Yeah. But while they suppress the idea of therapy, they suppress the idea of even within their own home talking about what happened. While they're doing all that, they're parading this child out to every news outlet that wants to talk to him. So he is he is plastered on every newspaper, every magazine, because he's hailed this rescuer and this hero, which he was with Timmy. I'm not saying he wasn't, but all of a sudden this 14-year-old boy that endured all of this is on every publication known to man, constantly on TV. So do you know what this does? Now he goes to school. He's trying to reintegrate at school. And now he's getting bullied at school, being called all kinds of names for what he had to have endured. Starts to kind of make fun of himself with his friends. What do you do, right? It's coping, it's defense. And it's getting bad. So now he even says, and this will break your heart, he says, I returned almost a grown man. And yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? Everything has changed. Sometimes I blame myself. I don't know. Sometimes if I should have even come home, would I have been better off if I didn't? So it wasn't the happy homecoming that you would hope for. So I'm going to read to you now. What time is it? Okay, we're doing okay. So I'm just going to read this word for word here. In early 1989, there was a 2-part television miniseries based on Stephen's experience, and it was called I Know My First Name is Stephen. The reason it was called that, you guys, is because, listen to this and listen how sad. When Stephen was first, when he rescued himself, when he gets to the police station and they see Timmy and they know, like, that's their local jurisdiction, right? So they know who Timmy is and who to call, his parents and all this and that. And then they start talking to Stephen and they realize, holy cow, this is that Stayner boy that went missing 7 years ago. Now they're, wildly and, frantic and whatever. And Stephen said to them, this was his verbatim words when he spoke with the deputies, he said, "My name is Stephen Stayner. I'm 14 years of age. I don't know my true birth date, but I use April 18th, 1965. I know my first name is Stephen, and I'm pretty sure my last name is Stayner. And if I have a middle name, I don't know it." And interestingly enough, the middle name that he was using was actually his real middle name. But that goes back to show you exactly how young he was and how manipulated he was so early on. Okay, so this docuseries is called I Know My First Name is Stephen. This was 1989. So he took a leave of absence from his job. Stephen did. Okay, so by now this would be, so he's 23 when this happens, okay? And I think I have a picture of him here. Or maybe I don't. Or maybe it didn't upload. Well, we'll come back to it. But here's a picture of Stephen and Timmy soon after. And there's another one of the two of them. I'm just showing, if you're listening, I'm showing just multiple pictures of Stephen and Timmy. Here he is with his parents again. Sweet boy. 10 years after he and Timmy were rescued, a statue was erected. I think I have a better picture of the statue, and it's a bronze statue of Stephen looking, like a rendering of Stephen looking down at Timmy, looking up at him, and they're holding hands and walking to capture the idea of them escaping from the hell that was Kenneth Purnell's house. So either way, Stephen acted as an advisor in this documentary about him. He fully signed off on the idea of this being written. He had a non-speaking part, but he actually played one of the two policemen who escort 14-year-old Stephen through the crowd to his waiting family. So he's got a cameo. By now he's got like a blonde mustache. He's got on like the tan, cop hat and outfit. And he worked closely with them as they made this entire documentary. He later said how difficult it was. He said it was one of the hardest things he's had to endure. However, he really, really wanted to do it. He learned that there was not any talk about this kind of thing. And so Stephen really takes his most horrific experience, and while not encouraged to talk about it at home, exploited basically left, right, and sideways with his own family and the media after the fact. He does everything he can to now try to prevent anything like this happening in children moving forward. So the miniseries was first broadcast by NBC on May 21st and 22nd, 1989. They sold the screening rights, and then it was released eventually as a feature-length movie. So that's a little bit about that. There's a lot of media in relation to this. There was a Hulu documentary in 2022. There's been books. So there's been a lot there. So he went, he refused to disclose all of his details of sexual abuse as time went on. So in 2007, Stephen's sister says that her brother didn't seek counseling because their father said he didn't need any, and just that he got on with his life, but he was pretty messed up. That's what his sister said later on. And she just goes on to talk about him being bullied by other kids because of what happened to him. He eventually dropped out of school because of this. He was drinking a lot. Now, this is one part of the story also that is sickening to me. Just pile it on the list, but is that he was kicked out of his home, his family's home, when he was 17 years old. So being a Mormon family, they were not going to put up with the drug use and the alcohol use of this poor child. So he can't talk about his problems. He'd been drinking and smoking pot at Kenneth's house, but he comes here and they say that's a hard no. And they kick him out at 17 after he'd been back home for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's rough. So his life does start to look up, though. So actually, I'm smiling when I say this because it's probably the best part of his life. Stephen, when he was 20 in 1985, he married 17-year-old Jody Edmondson, and they eventually went on to have 2 children pretty quickly, a daughter and a son. The girl's name is Ashley. Their son's name is Stephen Jr. At this time, Stephen starts to get kind of back into a church role. He starts to work with child abduction groups. He spoke with children about safety, personal safety. He gave interviews as an adult now, as more of a willing participant. He gives a lot of interviews about what happened to him. And he would always say that he really just wanted to do whatever he could, no matter how hard it was, to talk about his own life, to prevent anything like this from happening or to help teach children how to keep safe. And he had aspirations to become a police officer. I don't think I told you about that last time we talked about it. So on September 16th, 1989, so Stephen is at this point 24 years old. He's married. He'd been married for 4 years. And again, he's got a son and a daughter. I think they were like 2 and 3 or something like that. They're close in age and they were very young. And he was on his way home from work on his motorcycle and was not wearing a helmet. And as he crossed an intersection, there's a car driven by a man named Antonio Loera who flew by and ran straight into Stephen. And Stephen was thrown from his motorcycle and died in this accident.
That's horrible.
It's a tough one. Just, I don't know if you have any words, but
I can interject at this point, though, and say, before you transition into the other stuff, that over, I don't know, probably the last 8-10 years, a lot of departments have intel units.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked, I think, like 2 or 3 years, something like that, on an intel unit. And part of that assignment was dealing with people impersonating police officers.
Okay.
So one of the things I was going to mention earlier was just that you start to kind of put them into brackets once you get them identified and figure out what their motives are. You have the blue line lovers who just want to put tack vest on and blue line stickers and social media posts. Then you have the delusional people who believe they are cops, even though they aren't. And then you have the SA offenders that use it to lure victims in.
Like Kenneth.
Often, yeah, back then they probably would have used the term like the blue light bandits or whatever kind of thing. But I like to say that now a lot of that stuff gets caught early on. But yeah.
I just hate it. Like, it about puts me in tears every time. And like I said, I've known about this case for years, and then just kind of researching for the show tonight over the past couple of weeks has just been tough. It's heavy. This is a really, really tough show. And then to, every time when it comes back around to him dying at 24 years old, but and I said it to Brian earlier on a walk, just that as horrible as all of this has been, he did have that happiness. Like, there was a chunk of time in his life. And in fact, he died during that happiness when he had a wife who loved him. They say he doted on his kids. He was a great dad. He did say that he did pretty good with being realistic with his children. They were, again, little, they're toddlers. But he said essentially they had to be in arm's reach. That if they were outside, they could be on the front porch, but the door had to be open. And he said, as long as I can see them and I can hear them, I'm okay.
Fully understand.
Yeah. And I can't imagine had poor Stephen survived once his daughter, and particularly his son, became around 7 years old. I feel like that would have probably cropped up its own new, tough stuff to deal with. So if you want something else that's going to tug at your heartstrings so much, 500 people attended Stephen's funeral. And at this time, Timmy White, you remember 5-year-old Timmy White that Stephen rescued. By now, Timmy is 14 years old, and Timmy was actually a pallbearer at Stephen's funeral. They remained close over the years. Timmy White went on to become an LA County Sheriff's deputy. So Timmy got married, Timmy had a couple kids, and he became a cop, which was just really cool. And then, God, this case is so freaking horrible. In 2010, at age 35, Timmy dropped dead of a pulmonary embolism unexpectedly. Good gosh.
I do want to say that a lot of people, want to bash cops and do, run their mouths. And there's always that stereotype that, cops are power hungry, power tripping. They grow up getting bullied, so then they want to bully people. But that's not the case. That's maybe 0.0% of cops. Mostly what you find are stuff like that. People who've been through, maybe not kidnapped, obviously, but have lived through something and then find themselves not wanting anything like that to ever happen to anybody else, and then live up, a life where they can give back and help and protect.
You ready to turn it up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I will say now, what I'm about to tell you moving forward is bad. It's all bad. This is a crime show, but it is sad. Gosh, I don't want to say it's not sad. The stuff that we just came from, we're going to kind of change gears to a different kind of bad, but more crazy. So do you remember I told you about Timmy's brother, Kerry, who is 4 years older than him? Well, when Stephen comes back, at some point, Kerry has gone to live with an uncle. Okay. And Kerry says that basically it just didn't happen. Like, he didn't come back and get reintegrated into this family. Kerry will say their relationship wasn't the same. Stephen would have said the same thing in interviews. They just kind of couldn't get it back. Kerry will say, and so will the sisters, that while Stephen was gone, that mom just kind of buried her head and didn't function well. And that dad essentially ignored the rest of them. Like, his main focus was finding Stephen. You'll hear some sad things that maybe dad said to Kerry in reference to Stephen that would not be good for Kerry to hear. And it was tough. It was tough on the remaining siblings, because I think mom and dad, I don't know how you do handle it, so I'm not saying that, but in their minds, they just said they kind of put their head down and just tried to basically not bother them or make them upset. So they just kind of existed at this point. So when Kerry was age 3, okay, he was diagnosed with, it's a weird word. A lot of you may have heard of it, but it's called trichotillomania. So what that is the condition where you pull hair. But you pull hair to the point that it's compulsive. Oftentimes will result in bald spots. He was given medication, but it didn't really help. This actually affected him through his high school years. And the bald spots that he got from it led to him being very bullied. And so he wore a baseball cap. If you remember, actually in the photo with he he's in the back there between Dad and Carrie. I mean, between Dad and Steven. That's Carrie back there wearing a ball cap, a trucker cap, which is of the times. That's fine. But we know now why he wore them often. People around him and will say that he had very high intelligence. His classmates, his teachers would attest to this, and he was put in a lot of accelerated classes at the time as a result. He drew all the time, and so he contributed to the school newspaper in that way with illustrations and cartoons. He was named the most creative student in his graduating class at Merced High School. And after he graduated, Carrie went to work as a window installer at a glass company where he evidently developed a fantasy about ramming a truck into the workplace and killing everyone there and setting the business on fire. That's a disgruntled employee. So in 1991, Carrie, just a little frame of reference, if you remember, Stephen, so he was born in 65. So he was abducted in 72 and came back home in 81. Okay. So if I'm talking about 1995, we're like 14, 15 years after Stephen has come home. Okay. Meaning, Carrie's, he's an adult at this point, full on adult. And he tried to, kill himself with carbon monoxide that was in 1991, excuse me. In 1995, he was admitted to like a mental institution, after he said he had a nervous breakdown, and he had some treatment there and was released. And then he was arrested in 97 for possession of marijuana and methamphetamines. They dropped those charges. But then in 1997, Carrie was hired as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal, California. Portal. Just outside the Highway 140 entrance to Yosemite National Park. Did I just reference that? I did, because early in the show, I told you that Kenneth Parnell and his co-worker, Irvin, they worked in a capacity for a place at Yosemite. So what I have learned since then, if you are from that area or know anything about this, pipe up, at least at that time, if not currently, a lot of those businesses in and around Yosemite, there wasn't a lot of background checking happening. So a lot of it just kind of happened to be that, we talk about certain professions that tend to, or certain jobs that tend to hire more people with like felonious activities and things like that. Evidently, the Yellowstone stuff did just that. So Carrie got hired, like I said, as a handyman there at the Cedar Lodge Motel. Now I'm going to read to you. I have it here. And we won't go forever, guys. There's not a whole lot. There's a whole lot of information, but it won't take very long to convey now. So sorry. Okay. So as he's working in his handyman capacity there at the Cedar Lodge, one night I believe it was 1997. He knocks on the door of one of the residents there at the lodge. Okay. And this person is a woman. I'll let that go downstairs. Named Carol. Hang on. I'll make sure I give you that. Yes. Carol Sund. Sund. So Carol was there with her daughter and an exchange student from Argentina. Her daughter, Carol, was 45 at the time. Her daughter was 15, and the exchange student was 16 years old. So it's a woman and two teenage girls. Now, Carrie will go on. I'm about to tell you what he did in there, but he later will say that he had actually been kind of looking at another group of women to do these things to, but that they had a man with them. There was another time he was kind of paying attention, kind of stalking this girl with some ideas, and there was a man there. So when he realizes that this woman is checked into this hotel with these two teenage girls, and it seems to be no presence of a man, he goes on and takes his move. So he knocks on the door there, and he says that he's the handyman, and he says, "I'm here to fix a leak in that bathroom." So the mom, if she could tell you this, would probably tell you that she was very hesitant, because he will say that she opened the door slightly, she cracked it, and she kind of looked around and said, no, thank you. We don't have any problems with the leak. You can come back tomorrow if it seems to be an issue. Because this was like after 11 o'clock at night. All right. So then he says to her, well, you know, my boss is really making me check on this. Please just let me come take a look. I'll be right out of your hair, you know, and I'll go on. And then, as so many of us do, we shove aside our initial instinct, right, at the fear of seeming irrational or weird or dumb or naive or whatever, and let this thing take place. And so she let him in. So he goes straight into the bathroom. And then when he opens the door to come back out, he's got a gun in hand. Okay. Again, I'm talking about Carrie Stayner, Stephen Stayner's brother. Stephen, who was abducted and gone for 7 years. This is his older brother. Okay. So he has the gun in hand, and he tells them that he's just there. He says that the gun is unloaded, and he says he's just there to rob them. Like, please don't freak out. Don't make a ton of noise. I have to tie you up for your safety and for mine, right? And I'm just going to rob you. I need to make ends meet. I'm having a hard time doing that. So see, the resort was pretty desolate in the wintertime. There weren't a lot of people there, which is also going to aid in his favor for what's about to come. So he takes all three of them, bounds and gags them. He then takes Carol, who is the mom, alone into the bathroom. He sexually assaulted her, and then he strangled her with like a cloth or a towel. And then he carried her. The girls didn't see, and he carries her out to the trunk of her rental car, puts her body in the trunk of the rental car. He later tells investigators that he was surprised because he didn't know how hard it was to strangle someone. And then it took almost 5 minutes. Okay. So he gets the mom. He's done what he had to do there. He puts her in the trunk of the rental car. This is all coming from the actual trial where they take his taped confession and then play it. And they say that during the trial, when they're playing his confession and he's hearing his own words, that he starts shaking his head and closing his eyes and putting his fingers in his ears. So then, according to his taped confession, he took the clothes off the teenage girls. He tries to make them do things to each other. He assaults both of them. Evidently, horrifically, this goes on for hours. This goes on throughout most of the night. And after 6 or 7 hours of this, he says on the tape that he was very frustrated with them. He could not hold an erection. He was frustrated with their lack of cooperation, and they wouldn't stop crying. So he takes the exchange student girl into the bathroom. There he strangles her, and he put her in the trunk with Carol. He also had been assaulting her, obviously, all night. So now we only have Julie, who is Carol's daughter, left. As far as we know, Julie didn't necessarily know what had happened to her mother. That may be the only saving grace in this whole entire case. But he assaults Julie again, and then he takes her to the car. He makes her get in the car. Now, she doesn't know, or at least he tells authorities, that Julie didn't know that her mom and her friend were in the trunk, or their bodies were in the trunk. So she's in the passenger seat, and he says that they carried on conversation. My assumption is that Julie was trying to preserve her life and was going along with whatever he said. So they get to this point near Lake Don Pedro there, where he then assaulted her once more, slashed her throat, and he actually threw her like off a kind of an embankment. Okay. So evidently when they're trying to figure out what happened, when investigators find this car, so he leaves. He actually calls a cab. Okay. Has like a very normal conversation, talks about Bigfoot, as one does with the cabbie. Okay. Gets back in town, and eventually goes back to the area to set the car on fire. Quite some later. This is a pretty desolate area. So quite some time later, goes back, sets the car on fire. It does go on to burn the two bodies in the trunk, but Julie's body was not in the car. Remember, she was out away from it. So then when somebody stumbles upon this burned car, of course, investigators come out, they find 2 bodies in the trunk. But it's a little confusing because the bodies are burnt. So they have to, do some dental records and different things to identify who they are. Of course, we still have one person missing. They started looking for them because Carol's husband, who was set to go on a business trip, that's the only reason he didn't come with them to Yellowstone, didn't hear back from her. Eventually calls the hotel to see if she's still there. She didn't come home when she was supposed to. They say that they haven't seen her, but she hasn't checked out of her room. And then, like, her car's not there. So all of these things lead him to believe that he didn't know if they had a wreck or whatever. So that's when the investigation into their disappearance occurs. So during this, it's making news. Carrie he draws a very just kind of elementary archaic map with an X to show where you could find Julie's body, and writes the words, "We had fun with this one," on the map, and mails it to the police there. Eventually they do take a thumbprint from the stamp that was used to mail the map, even though he had someone else lick the stamp. So if you're a youngin', we used to have to lick stamps. They weren't stickers. Okay. So they came dry, you lick them and stick it on. He had someone else lick it so his DNA couldn't be found, but the dummy left a fingerprint. Yeah. So this was in February of 1987. All right. So the map arrived. So this was actually happened. So it wasn't until a couple years later that they found all this out. Again, Yellowstone National Park. This is very desolate. So it had been a couple years. But get this. So when the map was mailed to the FBI office in Modesto in March of 1999, it was opened by Special Agent Anthony Alston, who testified that he had neglected to wear gloves while handling it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what am I saying? She said that I'm saying,
you're saying Yellowstone?
Well, am I saying both? I'm sorry. That makes, I want you to guess. Hang on, because at some point I got it wrong in my brain. Whatever I started saying when we started the case is what it is, okay? But thank you, because I want to say it correctly. It's Yosemite. So it's Yosemite National Park. Let's keep that. It's Yosemite, guys. Don't get it wrong, everybody. It's Yosemite. So that's where this is all taking place, okay? So then they do go on and they find Julie's body based on the X on that map. Mm-hmm. There's that. But also, we know that that was in February. So he also winds up killing a woman named Joey Armstrong, who was a tour guide out there. And she was a young woman. So this is his 4th victim in the span of, I think, like 3 or 4 months. And he actually decapitates her, puts her head far from her body. So Stephen Stayner's brother, poor kidnapped, tortured Stephen Stayner for 7 years, who lived just a horrible life, comes home to what's supposed to be a loving family that turns into a circus, gets kicked out of his home 3 years later, finally starts to have a good life, gets married, has kids, and gets killed tragically in a motorcycle accident as a very young man at 24 years old. His older brother, we learn, is a serial killer. What in the heavens, right? So we know that these are 4 confirmed victims of Carrie's, but there are, 8 to 10 suspected more. So as police start looking into it, they're like, by this age, usually if this is what you're doing, you haven't just started. Yeah. So they start looking at other incidences in and around those areas and his connection to them. And they're quite, I won't go through those and, make it full of all of that, but that's what happened. I'm going to read to you now. We're getting close to wrapping it up. I am going to read to you, though, to give you a little, we went so far into detail because the story is primarily today about Stephen. We could have just made a whole show just on Carrie, obviously, right? Or even on poor little Timmy and just his experience. But I'm going to read to you what the FBI handler the one on this case, at least, not Handler, said when he interviewed Carrie, because we haven't really talked much about Carrie's childhood or his personality or his inclinations or anything like that. And so this is going to be verbatim, and this is going to be this guy's last name is Rennick. This is the FBI guy who eventually wrote a book about this. But he says, it was just Stayner and me, so he's talking about Carrie, alone in that interview room, and he had dropped a bombshell, claiming responsibility not just for the killing of Joey Armstrong, but also for the murders of Carol and Julie Sund and Silvina Peloso. But now he was imposing conditions for his cooperation. So now he's getting, arrogant. So Carrie is starting to say, okay, I'll cooperate, but under these conditions, right? Here's what I want from you. So let me just tell you what he wants, okay? So Rennick asks what he wants, and Rennick says of Carrie that he spoke obliquely, like he didn't want his request to sound as bad as it actually was. And so evidently Carrie says to him, quote, you work all kinds of cases. And he said that he hemmed and hawed as if he wanted him to fill in the blanks. Like he did when he wanted me to guess what cases he was referring to when he said he could give me closure. Eventually he got around to the point. I'd like to see pictures of little girls.
Yeah.
These are his conditions.
Yeah.
Okay. So the FBI agent says child pornography. And it says he wouldn't call it what it was. He just said again, pictures and videos of little girls. He said he thought we might have such evidence stored in the building.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. He says the thoughts and fantasies that consumed him preceded his brother Stephen's kidnapping. So meaning that Carrie, I know you know what that means, but Carrie, if you weren't paying attention, had started to have these thoughts and visions and ideas before his brother was kidnapped. This is very important to read because I've read so many sources, and I didn't believe it for a minute, but that will say, oh, the trauma of the kidnapping of Stephen is what caused Carrie to become a serial killer. That's not how this works. That's not how this works. Okay.
No, it's the opposite. Like I said earlier, like a lot of times then people go, they want to help more. They want to protect people. They don't. That's asinine.
Asinine, I say. So it says, when Carrie was just 11 and he had his own sexual victimization by his uncle, which happened about 6 months after Stephen went missing. So his brother is kidnapped, for heaven's sake. 6 months has gone by. I'm sure life is hell at home. And his uncle molests him. It says those experiences certainly were damaging. It poured fuel on a fire, but it was a fire that had already begun to smolder. As Carrie grew up in an environment rife with dysfunction and twisted sexuality. According to a psychiatrist who would later evaluate Carrie, you guys, oh my gosh, listen to this. For his defense team, the Stayner family tree was ridden with mental illness and sexual abuse going back 5 generations. According to the psychiatrist report, Carrie and Stephen's father, Delbert Stayner, was ordered into therapy for molesting his own daughters.
Oh, you said the therapist?
The dad.
Or
the
therapist. Sorry.
Yeah. The dad, Carrie and Stephen's dad. So they have the 3 sisters.
Yeah.
We don't know of any abuse, and maybe that wasn't his, maybe girls was what he was after, but we don't know of any abuse of Carrie or Stephen from the dad. But a psychiatrist did say that the dad, Del, had been ordered into. But remember how he didn't want Stephen to have any therapy?
Yeah.
Remember? In addition to her father's unwanted advances, one of Carrie's sisters said that Carrie started peeping on her and inappropriately touching her when she was 10. A cousin said that Carrie spied on her and her sisters and a neighbor girl hiding under their beds and secretly videotaping them in the bathroom and bedroom. And one relative described child sexual abuse as like a family sickness because it had been going on for so many generations.
Ooh.
So at every turn. So It has nothing to do. So it says like the fact that Carrie's brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and abused for 7 years adds an almost unfathomable dimension to the tragedy that enveloped this family. This is from the FBI agent's book, again, guys, that I'm reading. As the older brother, Carrie felt a natural, if undeserved, sense of responsibility for not protecting Stephen from harm. He felt more directly responsible. So he said that as a child, he worried that the obsessive thoughts he had about holding the neighbor girl against her will somehow caused Stephen to be kidnapped. Like him having those thoughts as a kid is what caused something bad to happen to his brother.
Mm-hmm.
He said the thoughts and fantasies that consumed him preceded his brother's kidnapping, and that when he was 11, oh no, I read you that already, sorry. He said that his parents the parents testified at trial that they both withdrew emotionally after Stephen went missing. They just talk about their depression and these kinds of things. But Carrie said that his dad was so heartbroken when Stephen was taken that he pushed Carrie away, saying that, quote, his real son was gone.
Oh.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
At every turn. One of the daughters said that her father insisted she never cry or show emotion because it would make her appear crazy like her mother.
Mm.
And that she had raised her own kids with the lack of emotional warmth her father inculcated in her. So Stephen and Carrie's maternal grandfather, their mom's father, when Stephen went missing, actually said to his daughter, Stephen's mother, was probably for the best anyway, because it's just another mouth to feed.
Mm.
Coincidentally enough, the house he lived at for the longest time, Stephen, with Kenneth Parnell, was just a few houses down from his maternal grandfather, and he never knew it because they weren't even in touch with each other.
Oh.
So anyway, he goes on with his demands about what he wants. Primarily, it's what I said it was. He wanted pictures of little girls. So he wanted a big stack of pictures and especially videos. And he said essentially like he's going to stick to that he called it his deal breaker. Okay. Oh, geez, Louise. So Carrie was tried in federal court since it occurred on federal land, Yosemite. To avoid a possible death sentence, he pled guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, felony first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse resulting in death. During the hearing, he stunned the courtroom when he suddenly broke down in tears and apologized. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry. I wish there was a reason, but there isn't. It's senseless. He has gone on to say that he had no reason for it and that he would likely do it again and that it was a fantasy in his head. He actually had like really gotten obsessed with the idea of doing these things to women. So he says that what he actually said when they said, what would you tell the parents? And he said, I'm sorry. Like essentially they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like it was going to happen one way or another. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity to the other murders in state court. His lawyers claimed that with his family having a history of sexual abuse and mental illness, it could manifest itself in his obsessive compulsive disorder. Remember his trichotillomania, the hair pulling, and his request to be provided with that pornography in return for his confession. So one of the doctors said that he did have an OCD, which that is a compulsive disorder. So that is like a spectrum of the OCD diagnosis, potentially mild autism, amongst some other things. He was found sane and he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, 1 count of kidnapping. He was sentenced to death for the killings. This was in 2002. Ever since then, he has been on death row at San Quentin State Prison, and he remains there. Although there have been no executions in California since 2006 because the governor of California has said that there won't be any executions on his watch. Oh my gosh. Okay. So then the very last thing I will tell you is that when I was looking for Yosemite, guys, I got my papers all out of kinds of whack here. Here we go. So in January of 2003, remember our friend Kenneth Parnell, by the way, he only served that 5 years, and then he went to work at a boys' home at one point.
Oh.
There were no mandates on what he could and couldn't do after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
He went on to do God knows what over the next few years. And finally, in January of 2003, he was arrested again. So at this time, he was 71 years old, and he was getting ill, and so he had a caregiver. And he asks his caregiver's sister to buy him a 4-year-old boy for $500. He was in like a 24-hour-a-day nursing care in his apartment. In his apartment, they came to him, but he had nursing care constantly. So this woman was actually aware of his past. So she went to the police to say, hey, this is what he's saying he wants. And so they set up a sting to be able to arrest him. So he requested that the child have, I'm not going to read this, but just basically that nothing would have happened already to the child sexually. And he paid $100 for a birth certificate, and he had $400 on his person for the completion of the transaction when he was to receive the child on January 3rd, 2003. He was arrested that day. Later, he tells the authorities, I just wanted a family. Jesus. He was convicted in 2004 on charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation, even though no child had been targeted. This happened successfully. And California has 3 strikes law. Well, thank God they had something. Mm-hmm. He had about 30 strikes by now. And so they actually bring back, so check this out. They bring back Timmy. So Timothy White, the 5-year-old that had been abducted that Stephen rescued, by now, this was 2000. I want to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. 2004. So Stephen had long ago passed away in the motorcycle accident, and Timmy eventually passes away in 2010. But in 2004, they bring Timothy in to testify and give his account of everything that happened to him and what he knew that happened to Stephen when he was under the care of Kenneth Parnell. And so they added that to the prosecution. And he was sentenced, I believe, to life in prison. Yeah, 25 years to life. And he remained incarcerated, unfortunately, only for 4 years when he died of natural causes. Jeez. Gosh, this case makes me want to, hurt people so horribly. So, and I will say, because it is late, we are going to wrap it up. We're not going to talk forever tonight like we usually do. I will say that we discussed this at length, even just as recently as earlier today, when I said that often we cover unsolves or unresolves, and it makes me feel like at least we're helping or getting a word out there, or, maybe, or whatever, bringing attention to something. We will cover things that have been, that have come to completion, that have been solved, or there's been a resolution there. With this one, it's so hard to talk about and so hard to think about that I thought, Drew Breezy, if you guys know who Drew Breezy is, he had a story up the other day in reference to a case that they've covered, and he put it well when he said that, like, the idea of crime or true crime in any kind of world podcast will say, because that's what we're talking about, there's a fine line between entertainment and education, or exploitation and education, right? And so I want to make sure that this isn't entertainment or just exploiting this horrible thing that happened to these people. But we discussed it and talked about the fact that actually, like on your end, and I'll let you get into that here in a second, but how, law enforcement or prospective law enforcement can look at it in ways to look at cases, or what to not do, or good ideas of what to do. And then, and I was even thinking about the fact that Stephen wanted to get out there and talk. Stephen wanted to talk. Stephen told his story. He wanted to prevent these things from happening to kids. And, ultimately, whether we talk about it or not, it happened. And it sounds like, I like the idea that there was resolution in both of their lives, Timothy's and Stephen's, with their marriages and their children. And then the poor women who were victimized and murdered by his brother Carrie, that just talks, we were talking about the idea that the rarity that someone is a little boy would be abducted from home, be kept for that many years, be kept alive, be rescued, all of the things that could happen, like how how rare all of that is. And then in the same family to have someone who's also a serial killer, I feel like those aren't big odds. So, I don't know. It was interesting to talk about and I don't know. Oh, real quick, I didn't tell you this. Carrie, who I told you, the brother whose uncle, he says, sexually assaulted him 6 months after Stephen went missing, when he was kind of in and out of living with him. When he was a little bit older, he lived with his uncle, and his uncle actually was murdered by his uncle's own shotgun, in his home, and it's unsolved to this day. And some will believe that potentially could have been one of Carrie's first murders, and that he snapped in regards to the stress of his brother being gone and in what his uncle had done to him previously. And that maybe if that was the first one, once he completed that act, of course, this is speculation, but scientifically or psychologically, it would make sense that once he completed that act, then that almost opened the floodgates to then not make him a serial killer, but to now to execute on these desires that he self-proclaiming had since he was a small child.
Yeah. Well, like we talked about, I think it was earlier today on the walk, about cases where people go missing or kidnapped, and then often we think the worst. We always think like if in fact they were kidnapped against their will, this ends almost always in death. But in a case like this, it didn't. And now, like we had talked about, like there probably are quite a few more cases where people do resurface, years later.
We know about Elizabeth Smart, you
yeah.
You guys help me. JC. It starts with a D. Dugard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it has happened more than we realize, I think, but also just, I don't know. I don't know.
I would say, I think it's like we mentioned earlier about the intel side, about identifying people on the proactive side for police work, mainly for stuff like that, because when all of a sudden a call comes in, which we've talked about this too, when you start working patterns of a van or a vehicle approaching teenagers or young kids in a neighborhood, and patrol officers get that call, they respond, and then detectives come in, they start working it. If you've got a strong intel unit, they can say, oh, hold on, what vehicle are you looking for? And if it's a very specific, I don't know, green panel van, with a loud muffler, oh, we know exactly who that is. He flashes a badge all the time. Then you take an investigation of an unknown, boom, all the way to that, and potentially you've already got a suspect identified because you've already done the work on the intel side through things like that, like impersonating law enforcement officers, or recidivism rate, where people are getting out and coming back into a neighborhood, and your special victims units or your intel units are like, okay, hey, this person's got a record of doing this, be aware of that. Okay, what do they drive? Where do they live?
Right. And interestingly enough, when the body of that Joey Armstrong, which we didn't talk much about, but she was the young tour guide at Yosemite, when they started investigating her murder, they of course kind of talked to the people who work in and around Yosemite, and Carrie did. And so when they go to talk to him, they just bring him in to question him like anyone else. Like, you work here, this thing happened, whatever. And he quickly confessed to her, not only her murder, but the other three from a couple of years prior. But when you go back farther to Kenneth Parnell and Irvin, when they worked at Yosemite, they worked right there near where little Stephen was taken. And so when people were being interviewed, that like had he just been looked at once, he was on a registry at that point. His name had been on a registry, a sex offender registry. And so this little boy's taken, but it just wasn't looked at, then. But the cops didn't assume Carrie at first because, like, again, I'm kind of hopping back and forth between two cases, but no one really kind of assumed him initially because of the terrible thing that had happened to his brother years prior. So it's kind of like looked at like he's part of this poor victim's family. I don't know. Yeah. I think we've exhausted.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah, I'm ready to kind of. If y'all don't see me next week, this is why. I'm gonna break from this mess. Okay. Well, do you have anything? We do have some people in the chats, and I appreciate you guys hanging in there. This is a late one tonight. I couldn't get my act together. So sorry.
I was trying to take the blame. I think I was getting blamed anyway, so.
What were you getting blamed for?
For the delay.
Oh, who was blaming you?
I think
I'm going to go with
Bosco
Silly.
And Silly,
okay.
I think both of them, maybe. Yeah.
Hey, Brittany.
A lot of talk about Huey Lewis early in the chat.
Oh, love it. I'm someone in the chats. Hey, Marine's Blood. Still got Michael in here. Bosco. I saw James Barber earlier. Thank you. I know your name's not D. Mitchell, but on here it is. And thank you for correcting me because sometimes I get talking and I'm so focused on the case, so focused on what we're talking about and all the thoughts and trying to keep things in order in a timeline or keep names straight and not say the wrong name. Sometimes the show will go off and we don't edit it. So since it's live, we drop it as is. So for better or for worse. So sometimes I don't go back and listen to entire shows, but sometimes I'll listen to some of the show to try to pull a short or a reel or a little clip from it. And I'll think, why did I just say that? Like, I know whatever. That's not that person's name, or I accidentally said this location and not that location because it just comes out of your mouth before you realize it. Silly.
Michael Broderick said he can't sleep now.
Sorry, Marvel.
Yeah.
You don't fit in the victimology of any of this entire show, so you should be okay. Hey, Zincop.
For James Barber, James probably got a $5 bet that we may have visitors coming to town this weekend.
Oh,
my
really?
Brother and cousin. No, you and I have got like a $5 bet. Whether my brother and cousin are going to come.
I thought James was saying that to you, meaning he already knew it.
No, I was going to tell him earlier in the chat. I can't do two things at once.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's see here. You live. Oh, what am I?
Did you just put that?
I did, but I didn't mean to. Sorry. Well, it's funny. It says, I wish I could sleep, but my boss wouldn't be happy. So Marine's Blood must be at work. I'm trying to see. Here we go. D. Mitchell is just saying that they live about 3 hours from there, from Yellowstone or from Yosemite. Clarify for me. So Bosco was dropping some Soulshine, some Allman Brothers lyrics on the Facebooks the other day.
Oh yeah?
Oh yeah. Oh, Yosemite. So do you know much about this case, D? I mean, I'm sure you do if you live that close. So Bosco says he needs a place to head toward. Come on down to the coast, Bosco. It's a good place.
It's always a good place. Also, you sent me Soulshine as one of your songs, and it's always a good memory.
That is a good memory. Yeah, it was a long time ago.
I love listening to it.
That's a great song.
It is.
If you guys don't know Soulshine by the Allman Brothers, I suggest it highly.
I also think people, I'm one of them that's guilty of it. I didn't fully get or understand how good the Allman Brothers are. Yeah. I think when I was younger, I mixed them up with the Doobie Brothers and some others. Doobie Brothers. But, yeah.
Maureen says that the Doobie Brothers, they don't sound the same.
No, I think just because when I was a kid, Brothers
just in
and
general.
Brothers.
I got you.
Yeah.
Like, what about the Everly Brothers?
What about the Smothers Brothers?
What about the Smothers Brothers? The Stayner Brothers. What about the
Van Zant Brothers?
Van Zant, there's a lot of them.
I don't know any others.
I don't know. I was gonna try to make a rhyme. Like, what about your mother's brothers? I couldn't. There's nothing. I got nothing.
No.
So Marine said that Bosco should head to the White House. Bosco 2028.
Mm-hmm.
Not even close. What? Michael Broderick is saying that Dickie Betts was one of his faves. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Smothers Brothers. I actually listened to a podcast recently where they were talking about a psychiatrist, and it was I'm referencing where Bosco was joking, saying that this group is too young for Smothers Brothers. And the show I was listening to was talking about a psychiatrist and how like somebody didn't want to have therapy and whatever, and at that time frame many years ago, and some didn't consider it science or truthful or whatever, and called and said something referencing like a quack, right? And one of the co-hosts was like in her 20s, I think. And she said, what? And she kept saying, what? And they're like, you've never heard that? And she said, no. And she legitimately had never heard, that phrase for, I thought, gosh, I guess that has aged out now. We're not, nobody,
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you have anything else?
I don't.
Okay.
I wish I did.
Well, you guys are awesome. You can go. I'm gonna let you do it.
There?
I was gonna read it for you, but you say it. Where can they find you, Brian Sanders?
They can find me here every Tuesday night.
That's right.
Live.
That's right.
And on Instagram, _disruptors_podcast. Probably the easiest thing to do would be to go to the Disruptors with Brian Sanders.
Okay.
.com.
Okay.
Email is on there. Training courses are on there. And eventually I'll start posting some more like training aids, still shots, things like that if people want to learn some more about gang hand signs, graffiti. Because people always go, oh, no one does graffiti. Everybody still does graffiti. Gang culture still cooking.
Okay.
I don't know. I think.
Okay. So you can find him at all those places, and definitely check that stuff out. You can find me, as always, at Andrea Upload on Instagram. That's the name of the YouTube channel as well. Like I said, it's a live show every Tuesday night on YouTube. Please get in the chats. We enjoy talking to you guys. We've got kind of our regulars that we always talk to that we have grown to feel like we know very well. And then we always enjoy seeing new faces and seeing new names and having new perspectives. Especially tonight was a little different just because it was so heavy and it is already solved. But when we talk about a lot of unsolved, or when we talk theories on cases that haven't been resolved yet, it's always interesting at the end of the show in the chats to, kind of hear your take on it, see what you're thinking. You can always shoot me a message. I'm about 1 week behind on Instagram. So whatever I post like tomorrow will be from last week's show. Oh, that's right. Last week you weren't here because last week I had ladies night.
No, I was so sad.
Last week I had ladies night with Beth LaMontagne. And she is one half of the dynamic duo of Greg and Beth. Or Beth and Greg, I should say. That's how it rolls off my tongue. I think the best. And they have their own show, The Bar's Open, with Beth and Greg. And so she was on. We often, or every few weeks, try to do kind of a ladies' night. It doesn't mean that the bad guy or the victim is a lady necessarily, but I try to kind of make it that way when she's on. And so last week we actually had a freaking wild case out of Tennessee. And it was actually a female murderer and a female victim. But you'll have to go check that out. That one was, I think on here it's titled The Youngest Female on Death Row. But my word, go to that one to listen and see what you determine on the idea of sentencing in a horrific crime, but with a young woman who had a horrific childhood. Yeah. I want to be like, can we do something fun next week? But it's true crime, so I don't know.
It is. We may have thought. Do
you think I could get Vanilla Ice on between now and then?
I think we could. Or
Tony Danza, but he didn't commit a crime.
Yeah, I feel like Tony Danza's just kind of crooning and singing, and I think Vanilla Ice has got some stories. Before I forget,
what?
I'm so sorry. They want a Huey Lewis gang sign. So I would assume like this will be the Huey Lewis gang sign. Doesn't that make like a big H?
That's how you, give me a.
I know what you're gonna do. You're gonna make a football.
Yes.
And then you're gonna kick it right through the
Yes.
field goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey y'all, help us out. We'll get Vanilla Ice on. I'm telling you, that dude's got some stories.
Tag him and tell him to come on night shift.
Yeah.
And then ask him if he remembers singing with me on stage.
Oh. Yeah.
Just ask him. Just ask
So
him.
I gotta add him to the list of people I need to beat up.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Probably beat up me. I'm the one who jumped on the stage. He was nice enough to hand me a microphone.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have anything to say? Do you want to show me your cool shirt?
Yes. Yeah. I'll give somebody $5 if they can guess anything about this shirt. Anything at all. Which I bet they can't. I bet actually I've got money on who will guess the shirt.
Like what movie that's from? Not
Yes.
the words, guys, but just
No. Yeah. Where it's from. Also, what do we know about this shirt?
Yeah, tell them.
No, you
I
tell
wasn't
'em.
just having you model. I mean,
We
you're
got a
welcome to.
sponsor.
We got a sponsor. High five. Can we high five on that? Does that work?
Yeah.
Our hands just disappeared.
Yeah. There is a company out there called Illicit Apparel.
Davey said Cobra real quick.
Oh.
Bosco did too. Davey beat you.
Good job. Actually, if people pay attention, I wear a lot of
Yeah.
kooky shirts like that. Like I'll wear like Snake Plissken's
Snake.
Escape from New York or whatever. So anytime I can find something cool like that. But either way, I love the shirt. It's Next Level Apparel, actual material. But yes.
So this is going to be our sponsor. We did not do a good job. We're already failing in our.
Sorry.
Jeez.
Sorry. We'll get better about pitching it.
About pitching it, but it's a fairly new, like I say merch. I mean, to us, we say merch for everything, but it's a fairly new, like t-shirt, hat, clothing, sweatshirt, hoodie company, and they're from the Southeast. And it was kind of one of those. We're like, we could use a sponsor that also is like that. We're not like a huge corporation that we feel like stressed about or whatever, because we're both still very busy with other stuff right now. But yeah, so we were like, we all said that we'd give it a go. And so they actually have agreed to carry some night shift and disruptors material as well. So you can find
they made a little promo trucker
on there. Yes. So their website it's ready, it's up and ready to go. But evidently they just continually add stuff to it. So it's always good to check back. But again, that is Illicit Apparel .com. Yeah, that's the name of the company. Yeah.
Yes. Illicit Apparel Daily Threads.
Illicit Apparel Daily Threads. I'm not good at sponsorship.
We'll type something up.
We will. We'll put it up, but you'll get a discount. So we need to put the discount code out there for ordering. And well, yeah, we do. I mean, that's the whole idea of the sponsor. Yeah. Cheapskate, I tell you what.
I don't know what I'm doing.
All right. Well, I got Halloween.
Yeah, I would like to do a fun show. For a long time,
yes,
I tried to get you on as a guest, and you were like, "What am I going to talk about?"
You still haven't got me on your show.
I know. I tried over and you were like, "I know, but what are we going to talk about? Like, what are we not going to talk about? We talk about everything."
I just realized that you've still not put me on your show.
We talked about it a lot.
Real fast on a funny note as we end this horrible story. You were talking about Vanilla and you were joking, saying, is that someone you need to put on your list?
Oh,
and then Silly said she thought he'd take you, but then Bosco defended your honor and said that you'd take him.
Yeah.
And then Silly did come back to say,
what?
Where'd she go? She says, nay, Bosco. Vanilla has the power of the 90s. Never count out a man with lined eyebrows. He'll mess you up.
I will say that I don't have any beef with Vanilla.
No, absolutely not.
I would love to have that dude on the show. Like I said, I know he's got stories. I've heard a few. You hear a few in the rumor mill.
Oh yeah.
And I want to talk about when you were like singing and dancing on stage.
He won't remember that mess. I think everybody did that. And thank the Lord in the heavens, there was no recording devices back
There
then.
is somewhere there is a recording.
Gosh.
And
I was
I
wearing
shall
like
find it.
slacks from the Limited or some crap. That's awful. All right. We're going to go. But you guys are awesome. We love you. We appreciate your support as always. Tell them good night. You want to tell them good night?
Yeah, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. That's really sweet. All right. Well, until next week, we will